How do we prepare our children to live in an ever increasing secular culture? A culture that is moving, it seems, further and further away from those traditional values and mores, not to mention further and further away from what we as Christians would view as God's plan or God's will or God's standards. How do we prepare our kids to grow up and live in a world that is increasingly moving away from those things that we hold near and dear? We're going to talk about that today on the March or Die Show. Glad to have you joining us. This is the show where we do our very best every single episode to give you the information and perspectives you need to march when it would be easier to stay where you are and die. You need information, you need principles, and you need perspectives to understand how to move forward when it would be so much easier to just say, forget it. And on our topic today, a lot of parents have just said, forget it. Even good parents, Christian parents, strong parents have said, I just don't know what to do. I'll pray and I'll hope and see how it all works out. But there's a lot more that you can do. And our guest today has a lot to say about that. Very grateful to have him on. Before we get there, however, if you have not yet subscribed to the show, please do that right now. Go ahead and subscribe. If you're listening to the audio version, subscribe wherever you're listening from. If you're watching online on YouTube, go ahead and subscribe there on YouTube. That would be fantastic. And really appreciate it. This is a very, very helpful conversation today. My guest is Dr. Owen Anderson. Dr. Anderson is a tenured professor at Arizona State University. He is also a pastor. And man, it seems like, and we talk about this a little bit in the interview, those two worlds never cross over, right? There's no crossover between a tenured professor in a public university and a pastor. He pastors a Reformed church, so a very theologically conservative church. And man, his insights on not only him existing and surviving and thriving in that environment, but helping us to understand how to prepare our kids to thrive in an environment like that, the things we need to think about, how we can train them, how we can raise them up, how we can prepare them. Very, very helpful conversation, and really excited that he would be on with us. So without further ado, my guest, Dr. Owen Anderson. Dr. Anderson, thank you for joining me. Excited to have you on today.
Thanks for having me here to talk about this.
We have, there's a whole bunch we could talk about, but this is a topic that I am particularly interested in and passionate about. I've raised kids. I've got 2 kids still in high school, and the world is changing, and raising kids in a secular world. It's funny. We used to have these, there were kind of like cultural norms, things that we just accepted as being true and okay, and everyone went along with that. And that just doesn't exist anymore. And so I think, for parents raising their kids in a world that is increasingly, anti-God and throwing off the social and moral mores we've always held to, is becoming more and more challenging, and a lot of questions about what do you do. And so, man, I really appreciate you coming on. I guess we'll let's just start with what you're doing now and how you got here, because you have you're kind of like 2 tracks at the same time, a tenured professor at Arizona State, a pastor of a church, and most people would say those 2 tracks never cross, but you're right in the middle of it.
Yep, I might be one of the only people who does that too, especially in the humanities, because I teach philosophy and religious studies. I've been teaching at ASU for 25 years.
Wow.
And I've climbed up the rank of, tenured professor, done all the publishing stuff you have to do, and then also Reformed pastor.
Yeah.
And so, those usually don't overlap. The humanities right now, which means like philosophy, religious studies, history, English literature, those are the craziest classes. Those are the ones where you'll hear stories coming out about, drag queen hour at college or something. So being in philosophy, I'm right in the middle of those things. Unfortunately, that same content is drifting into our STEM content also. So it's no longer safe to say, well, I'm not going to go and be an English major. I'm going to be an engineer.
Yeah.
Well, I can give some examples about how it's also gone into those areas. So we're living in a day where the lines are clearly drawn. Maybe 60 years ago, theological liberalism could hide itself really well. But now it's very clear. You've got Bishop Budd lecturing the president, wearing a bishop's outfit, pro-trans, and she thinks she can lecture him on what Jesus says, right? So it's like as clearly these lines are drawn as clear as they can be. So I relate a lot. I've got 4 kids also. I relate to what you said. We need to prepare our children for this.
Yeah.
It's a lot different than when I went to university. When I went to university, we all knew that secular universities are liberal. And I didn't expect my professors to be Christian, and they weren't. I had
Right.
only a couple
Right.
exceptions, but they also weren't so in your face about it. And that's what's changed now. It's not just, oh, you're a Christian, okay, that's kind of outdated, whatever, let's get on with the class. But now it's Christianity's evil. It's the colonizing religion and the oppressing religion, and it needs to be stopped.
You've stayed in this environment for, you said, 25 years. I'd love to hear your perspective on that, because we talk to Christian teachers who are also instructors, teachers in public schools, whether it's elementary or high school, colleges, universities, and often the perspective is, I want to be a light in a dark place. I understand that. It's kind of that missional aspect. Um, how do you think about that? How do you view that as a Christian in that environment? It's increasingly secular, going the direction that you just outlined. How do you think of yourself in that environment? And then maybe at what point do you say, I can't be here anymore? I'm sure you've thought
Yeah.
about those things.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And before we started, you and I were talking about jujitsu.
Yeah.
And so I might use some jujitsu
Yeah.
analogies.
It's one of my favorite topics. So go ahead.
Yeah. Well, because it's basically like asking, hey, when are you going to tap?
Yeah.
And if
right.
it's just pressure, I'm not going to tap. Right?
Right.
I know how to survive through that.
Mhm.
And I don't think that you'll ever be able to actually get a joint lock or a choke on Christianity. So
Yeah.
I'm not worried about that. But in terms of the fruitfulness of it, I'm kind of serving at the Lord's pleasure. It seems like he's opened this door. I'm one of 3 professors who are philosophy professors and reformed at a state university in the country out of
Wow.
thousands.
Wow.
So this is not like something that you would just take lightly and say, well, maybe I'll go get another job. The Lord seems to open this door,
Sure.
and it's the missional things that you said, but it's also that I'm ASU has allowed me to do some really great research and publications. I've published on Princeton theology. I've done a ton of work on natural law and natural theology. So ASU's given me that environment to do those things. And so someone could say, well, isn't that great then? Yeah, it's been a really good job for those reasons. And mostly, I would say things changed around 2012. So halfway into my current career. But mostly I'm kind of left alone on postmodern reasons, which is, well, Anderson's doing his reformed thing and we're doing our Michael Foucault thing.
Yeah.
And so just leave each other alone. But I did notice that I think with the election of Obama, people got more I think they thought hey, we just won. It's over now. We can finally get rid of the Christians.
Yeah.
And that's when they started putting in decolonizing. I was told we have to decolonize our classrooms.
Yeah.
And I said, that's when I first said, no, I'm not doing that. Because that's the first time I felt they stepped over the line.
What do you say to aspiring young people who want to go into education in the in the public system, again, at whatever level, but in the public system? How would you tell them to think about what they're getting into?
Yeah, we need that. We need people who are kind of the front lines. I also use an analogy of the Marines. I've never been a Marine. I admire them. And basically, I'm kind of like establishing the beachhead. You land, you get the beachhead secured, the Army can come in and start building stuff and advance forward. And so at this stage, we're like, hey, we need some Christian Marines to go into the university. It was ours. We invented it 1,000 years ago.
Right.
And it's still ours. It's still the Lord's. He's king of all things. So we need to reclaim it. And so I would encourage them to do that, but I would warn them, just like with the Marines, it's a dangerous thing to do. You've got to be strong in your faith. And not everybody can. Some people are more easily swayed than others. Peer pressure matters to them. People's opinions of them matter to them. And so if that's true, it may not be the job for you. But if you can be strong in your faith, and then the second ingredient is you've got to have good mentors. I was given in God's providence some good mentors who helped me through it. But there's no lone wolf situation. So even though I'm alone at work, I'm not a lone wolf. I've got mentors who help me. I've got a church community. I've got good friends.
What was your personal upbringing like? Were you raised in a Christian home? Did you come to faith later? What was your kind of faith journey?
Yeah, I was raised in just great Christian parents. I'm so thankful for them. Taught me the gospel from a young age. I remember
Yeah.
praying for Christ to be my savior with my mom, probably about age 4. And it was evangelical Bible churches, so independent Bible churches, and going to things like Awana and
Right.
Young
Right.
Life.
Right.
So all that stuff was great. Now I didn't have the attitude I have now. Always I complained, and as a late teen, I had
Of course.
my parents didn't help me out, et cetera, et cetera,
Yeah.
and so you go through those developmental phases, especially late teens. You're kind of leaving your home and you're becoming your own person. But by God's grace, He kept me in the faith and helped me. I'm kind of argumentative. My parents knew that about me, and so I think they were thinking I'd be a lawyer, and I came home and said I'm going to be a philosopher. And, oh no, what does that mean?
Right.
So, but I found a way to get paid to debate theology in a public setting. So I have friends that are at Christian universities, and I admired. I get a little jealous sometimes because you can open up with prayer. You have Christian colleagues you're talking with. With me, it's none of that. But at the same time, it's also like, yeah, it's just me. I get to go in there. I sing psalms on campus. I don't know that anyone else has done that at ASU, and it's good for that to happen.
It's interesting to hear you talk about it like that. I was in the Marine Corps, and I was raised in a pastor's home.
So
yeah.
My
So
analogy hit home.
That analogy is perfect, and it makes sense to me. But the clear lines, right? So I was, my dad was a pastor. I was raised in that environment, accepted Christ very young, and growing up, I said early in my life, I want to be a Marine. That's what I want to be. That's what I want to do. And the well-meaning Christian people in my life would say like, well, you can't be a Christian in the Marine Corps, and because they knew a kid, right? They knew a kid that came from a Christian home and shipwrecked his life or whatever. And so this was kind of the feedback that I got all of the time. And then we had a Christian family friend who was a Marine, sat me down one day and said, look, if that's what God wants you to do, then, you need to go after it. But here are some things that you need to consider. He's been a mentor in my life. But I remember getting, kind of into the early stages of just training, right? So you go through, I went through an officer commissioning program. So I went to officer candidate school and then those early schools. And one thing that struck me as a Christian was how clear the lines are.
Yeah.
People talk about how hard it is to be a Christian in that environment. And certainly there are things that you're exposed to and around and whatever that you might not be in another environment. But for me, being a Christian in that environment was so easy because it's like you are or you aren't. There's no in between.
Same thing with universities. I mean, if you go to a Christian university, you're going to find the same sins, but they're kind of covered up and hidden.
Yeah.
Whereas here it's like, you've got professors who say we should chemically castrate minors who are gender confused. All right, that's pretty
clear.
Line.
Pretty clear. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because I think we're so afraid that our kids are going to be exposed to something, but if we help them to understand what to believe, I have 2 adult kids. My daughter actually went to Chapman University here in Southern California, so secular university. But I have 2 teenage kids that are in a Christian, and I put Christian in quotes, high school here in town. And man, that scares me a lot more than it does my daughter who went to a secular private university, because it's so subtle. The things they come home with and the things that we talk about, we wouldn't have those conversations if they weren't in a Christian where it's just kind of in the background and it's not right in your face. That's almost more difficult to deal with than the very clear, very stark difference.
Yeah, I think it is. And I think, in God's providence, He brings the church through those kinds of stages. And sometimes it's to chastise the church and say, hey, you need to wake up. You're not doing the Great Commission. You've compromised. You've let wolves into the flock. I mean, like I mentioned, Bishop Budd before upstanding about what Jesus thinks. I mean, who takes that seriously?
Right.
But now the lines are so clear. There's the Philistines and there's Israel, and there's no difference. I mean, neither one misunderstands what's going on. And the professors who want to teach your children, and they want you to pay $60,000 for your children to be taught their radical philosophy. They know Christianity is the enemy, and they will say that. Now, on the front side, when you go to university, they're going to say, "Hey, Christianity, do you like great book stuff? Our honors college, they do great books. You can read and learn about the great ideas, and they'll present all this stuff nice. But I'm sitting in the faculty meetings and I hear them laughing about destroying the faith of Christian children.
Wow.
They think it's a funny game.
Yeah. Wow.
And they don't tell the parents that, of course. So what I did was I started a Substack, Dr. Owen Anderson, Dr. Owen Anderson, just to kind of like be a reporter. I'm just documenting what this stuff is. And the parents who contact me say, I knew it was bad.
Yeah.
I didn't know it was this bad.
Yeah.
It's way worse than I thought.
Yeah.
So that's one way for parents to stay informed. It doesn't mean your child doesn't go there, but it means you got to know your child. Again, is this someone who's easily swayed by peer pressure and wants to fit in, or is this someone who can stand their ground? But even if they can stand their ground, you got to tell them what's coming down the pike. I mean, they need to know what they'll encounter. And I think once that happens, the truth is sin is so cartoonish and clownish. It's laughable. Once you know what's coming down the road. Wait, a kid who's confused because he played with Barbie and his dad thinks now he's a girl, he should have his private part cut off.
Yeah.
Like, that's nonsense.
Yeah.
So once you explain it to them, they'll be prepared. But what I've seen happen to a number of students is that they come in and they've gotten a really weak version of what atheists think from maybe a youth group or something. Their parents just kind of, atheists are, have this view. And it wasn't a very robust, it wasn't the strongest opponent.
Yeah.
And so when they get into these classes and the professors are very nice people and they'll say, hey, I love, Jesus, he was a great moral teacher. He's one of the most important moral teachers. I mean, that's an older book though, so it doesn't necessarily apply to our time,
Right,
but it was great back then. And the students immediately disarmed because, okay, this guy, I guess he likes Jesus. And then, or she, and then says, but here's what we know now. Here's Jesus today would be on the trans side of the debate.
Right.
And the students disarm. So you got to prepare your students, which again, to use an example from your world, is boot camp and any training ahead of time. You're only going to succeed insofar as you've done that.
Yeah, that's good. Before my daughter went to, so she went to Chapman. She's an accountant now, so she went into the business school. She went a little bit older. She was, I think for 3 years, she had gone to a local community college. So she lived at home. She was involved with our youth group and in our church and all those things. Before she went to Chapman, that school is 45 minutes away from our house. And so she lived on campus. Because she was an older student, it was actually off campus, on campus. It was about as perfect a situation as you could have going into, I think, that environment. Chapman is also pretty conservative
it's a professional focused school. They're not there they're not there just a party or something.
That's exactly right. And I mean, they don't scholarship sports teams and things like that. So that's a different environment, but I think she was more prepared than the average student going into that because of, she's older, she'd been at home longer and all those kind of things. But I wonder what would have happened if she had started there. Right. And this is a hard conversation to have with parents because sometimes, we could look at elementary school, right? I have to send my kids to elementary school to the local elementary school because of, work. I'm a single parent or whatever the case. A lot of weird situations. High school and on into college. I've talked to Ben Merkel about this at New St. Andrews, who you know well, and man, he has such a great mind on this, and he's given some great input and great advice. Which is if you're going to send your kids there, you need to be very involved in discipleship and all those things. But how do you, maybe on two levels, right? So you have young kids. How do you prepare them for a world that is increasingly anti-God? We know that that's, just kind of the natural slope of things. So how do you prepare them to be able to deal with this stuff, whether they end up in the military or end up in a secular university or, heaven forbid, something happens to you and a relative puts them in another school, whatever the case. So young kids, how do you prepare them? And then if you have an older teenager that's thinking about their future, how do you help them think right about their future and make those decisions?
Yeah, I mean, those are great questions. And I've done a lot of work on that in terms of either, like I said, my Substack, but also just preparing. I have a guide that's the top 10 challenges a Christian student will face at a secular university. It's over on Frank Turek's blog. He posted that, and he and I had a discussion about it. And so I try to put out material like that because I think if I had to narrow it down, I'd say a couple things. I'm sure you are also firmly a believer of parent-centered education. We're the ones in charge of our kids, not the state, not anyone else. So know your child, know their strengths and weaknesses, and then tailor their education that way. So you're right. There are some cases where you need to go to public school, but if you're at public school, Christian private school, charter school, homeschool, co-op, whatever it is, unbelief is subtle. It's the first thing we're told about evil in Genesis 3. It's crafty and subtle. And so it's going to creep in at any of those settings. And sometimes public school is more clear, like you said. You just have very clear lines drawn at public school, whereas at a Christian school, it might not be as much.
Right. Sure.
So it's hard to say like this one is going to be more challenging. I'm not suggesting that public school and Christian school are equal 100%, but just from the parenting perspective.
Right.
So then the other thing I would say then is knowing your child and then knowing the strategies. You might not always know the specific things that get brought up. Like one time my daughter came home from 7th grade and said, "Dad, what's a transsexual witch?" I was like, what? Didn't see that one coming.
Well, there's a lot in that question.
Yeah, but thankfully I could answer the question. But you may not always catch like the individual things, but know the strategy of the enemy. And the strategy of the enemy is, like I said, usually at first to present it with a smile and to insinuate it. And so that's going to be the way it goes. It's going to say, this is actually good. God told you it's not good, but he's wrong. It is good. And that also carries over to social media, which we all know is dangerous. I mean, secular psychologists say this is terrible for the developing brain. But at the same time, we're just saturated with it. So it's the same kind of thing. And in one way, it's more dangerous because your public school teacher doesn't get to hang out in your kid's bedroom in the afternoon with your kid, but they'll be in their door shut looking at stuff on the internet. So parents just have to be vigilant and be aware. And my philosophy is always probably the same as yours as a Marine and a jiu-jitsu guy. You got to prepare them for it. Never hide them. You can't protect them. I mean, maybe you say there's some personalities that you need to do that, but in general, you got to prepare them because they're going to face it.
Yeah, and I think the role of a parent is that, right? It's preparing our kids to live without us. I mean, just put simply, so they can go out into the world without us. How do you help?
Well, one piece of advice I have to live through, my parents live through it, I know lots of people live through it, is you're developing an individual adult human.
Yes.
Which means parenting ends and you're along for the ride, so to speak, and it might be bumpier than you'd like, but you got to trust God that he has the bigger vision.
That's good.
So you can panic when your 18-year-old says, "You know what? I'm not a Christian after all." That's not good. That's no fun. But at the same time, God's eternal. He has this bigger plan. So parents also need to have that bigger vision to say, all right, what are your questions? What are you wrestling with? What's going on?
Yeah. When a 17, 18-year-old kid who's looking at their future, they're starting to look at colleges and trying to understand, Christian college, not Christian college, something else. How should they, process that? What are the steps they should go through to? I mean, would you always push an 18-year-old freshman to a Christian college or university before they'd go somewhere else, or not? How do you help them navigate that?
Well, in our day, so you and I are coming out of a number of decades where the story was you've got to get a 4-year education to have a good job. Now, I think that's mostly been exposed as false, although some parents may not have got that message. Some kids may not. They're still on that. A 4-year degree can open some doors for you, but there are other paths that also open doors. But if someone says, well, I really want the 4-year degree path, okay, another thing I would tell them is colleges right now are selling an experience. And I actually had a college recruiter tell one of my kids that. It's the whole experience. So they want you there for 4 years. They've got a great gym. They've got a nice pool and hot tub. They've got a lot of fun parties and stuff. And Christian ones do the same thing.
Sure.
And so you have to ask yourself as a young person, do I really want that for 4 years? That sounds fun, but at the same time, is that really good from 18 to 22 to spend 4 years on that? Because you can get this so-called 4-year degree. I would say you could probably get in 2 years. And I don't mean by only doubling up on classes, but there are ways you can test out of classes. One is called the CLEP tests. And they don't often tell students about this. It's kind of like AP tests, but you can take CLEP tests. You might pay, I don't know what it is, $100 for a test. And you show that you have like a U.S. history test. You already know the stuff you'd learn in history, U.S. History 101. You get the 3 credits. And so you can test out of a lot of that stuff if you've had a good high school education. And if you've gone to like a classical education, I guarantee you'll be able to test out of that. And you can get a lot of that material out of the way to get right to your major and start focusing on those topics. So I think that we need to be wise. None of us have, I come from a rank of economics where you don't have 60 grand laying around. So if I can avoid spending that, I'm going to.
Yeah. That was one of the funniest things. We have a good junior college here, and they do fine.
Yep.
And it was, I forget what the math was exactly, but it was like, $70 a credit or something.
Mm-hmm.
And going to university was like $700 a
Yep,
credit
exactly,
or something to start, right? And I'm thinking, like, what in the world? How would a parent ever? Man, there's freshman kids go to those schools. They don't know what they want to do or where they want to end up. They haven't declared a major, and yet it's their parents are paying $60,000 a year to send them, which is insane to me.
Well, can you imagine any other area of life? Let's say you buy a car. So, you bought a car? Yeah, because I'm trying to decide what car to buy.
Right.
Well, but you already bought one. Like, no one does that. No one spends the money while they're trying to decide what to do with their life. So we've had this really strange kind of fueling of postponing adulthood, leaving adolescence into your mid-20s. And I think that's what the television show Arrested Development tried to make humor out of. Arrested Development. Like, you're an adult and you're acting like you're 14 still. Right. And so we've encouraged that kind of behavior. But you're right to mention junior colleges or community colleges, because at least here in my experience in Arizona, almost every time when I meet a community college professor or a university professor, the community college professor is a better teacher. They may not be a researcher, which is what a university professor is, but they're great teachers, and it's so much more affordable. You'll actually learn stuff. And most of the time, it's much less politicized. Not always.
Well, I for my kids, I loved it because they were living at home. I saw them every day. Yep. We were having conversations about whatever they had taught or learned.
Exactly.
I'm in California, right? So they were required to take a California history test or history class, which was, as far left as it could possibly be, right? But they're coming home every day, and we're having conversations about this. Me and my 19-year-old kids. So
that's great.
I think it allows you to have a lot more input into
it. Does, and building those relationships as a parent is just central. You got to have that.
Okay, so all that's super helpful. You're sitting in the middle of a university writing about how bad university is. What has the response of the university to you been? Again, you've been at this a while, so they know you're doing it.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm probably the most famous unmentioned professor at ASU. Meaning, everyone knows about Anderson and what he's doing, but they don't want to talk about him because that might even make him more popular.
Yeah, right.
But basically, I'm the reason university tenure systems were invented. So the tenure system means that it's like the same as a medical degree. When you finish your medical studies, you go into your internship for a number of years. And if you don't pass that, you don't become an actual MD. So it's a really similar idea, which is basically kind of like an apprenticeship. You're called an assistant professor for 6 years. At the end of that, you apply for tenure. And if you get tenure, you're called an associate professor now. And then you can have a final promotion to full professor, which is where I'm at. And so I've done all that work. I'm tenured. And that means I've been judged by a jury of my peers. I don't believe any of them were Christians, but they looked at my work and said, yeah, this is quality work. Right. And so we made that position, a tenured professor, to protect research from unnecessary influence, pressures like money, bribes. So it was originally invented to protect that kind of person. Now, for the last 100 years, it's protect atheists who hate God.
Yeah, right. Right.
But it's flipped now. They're in the majority, and there's just one guy, me. So now it protects me. So if ASU fired me for this reason, they potentially lose their credentials. It would be a national story. Then they know that. There are things I could do that are immoral and get fired over.
Right.
But and I've actually had someone accuse me of that, falsely accuse me of it, and try to run it up the line, accuse me of saying a racist comment to her. And if that was true, I could be in big trouble. I mean, but it was all documented, and nothing about race was in the thing that she said was the comment. And so it was clearly a weaponization of ASU's HR department to put a little fear into me. Didn't work, but to say, hey, Anderson, we're watching you, and we can make up accusations to get you out of here if you don't watch it. So that one backfired. I actually had a First Amendment lawyer contact ASU and say, back off. This is clearly a fake accusation. So that kind of stuff can happen. But ASU right now, let's say the administrators aren't happy about it. They've got to know in their minds, though, this is why we have tenure. Yeah. And let's say 30 years down the road, when they look back, people are going to say, yeah, that was a really nasty time, but Anderson was speaking up, and that's what tenure's for.
Yeah. Yeah. So it can be used on either side. tenure, and it's funny you mentioned that, but in a positive light. I don't know if I've ever heard anyone talk about tenure in a positive
Yeah,
light. It
it
was like
hasn't been good
they're
for a long
tenured, you
time.
can't get rid of them. We've got to keep them.
It was usually used to protect against the church.
Right.
So this is how liberal theology infiltrated
Right.
first our seminaries, then our universities, was because church officials would say, hey, this guy's not orthodox. And so they invented tenure to say, yeah, but he's got tenure.
I like to hear it being used in a positive way because it's not always used in a positive way.
Well, I kind of enjoy that too. I mean, it's really similar to like a sweep and then a submission. They'll complain about like privilege.
Yeah.
And so I like to flip that stuff back on and be like, man, you're the most privileged person on earth. Like you're paid, totally safe, to talk about whatever you want. And you're complaining as if you've had a hard time and the man has set you back. And none of that's true.
What's the difference between, reporting on what's happening, talking about what's happening from your seat as a pastor? I'd say more as a theologian maybe than a pastor, but someone who understands God's word and what God would have for us to do. Reporting on that, it's almost a responsibility that you have to some degree. Yeah. And walking around with a stick and poking people in the eye. I think Christians sometimes get a bad reputation in these environments because it's almost like they're constantly looking for a fight instead of just being who they are. Can you talk about that for a minute? Because it seems like you've figured out how to navigate that.
Well, and that's a great question because you're right. I think I've seen it more the other side, which is that they're just wet noodles. You can just knock them over and they'll do whatever you want. Hey, I'm so sorry, sir. I'm so sorry that I mentioned Jesus. But you're right. Then they might have some people might get the other side. And I wonder, my colleagues would probably say that's what I am. I'm kind of argumentative or something. But my actual trajectory, if you're able to stand back and look at it, like I said, I only objected once someone said, you're putting this into your class. And I said, no, that violates our policies.
Right.
And then as they increasingly, what I object to, not what they do, they can do whatever they want in their classes. What I object to is, well, I should say whatever they want. We have a policy manual. You can't violate that. So I do point out times where they're violating that. But when we're in faculty meetings and I had a colleague in the fall talk about how evangelicals can't be real scholars because he wanted to insult Grand Canyon University, which is near us, but he made a shot at all evangelicals. And so that's the kind of stuff I bring up. And they might say, he didn't mean it. He's a nice guy. He didn't mean it. But it's like, you would never tolerate that if I had said something like that about an entire group. So I think what you have to do is draw boundaries and keep them. But that's a maturity part of knowing what is a mature boundary. It can't be everything. I can't go into ASU and argue about paedo-baptism, right? This is not the place to do it. Right. But I can go in and say, hey, free speech and our policy manual says the following. We got to keep that.
Yeah, I'd like to drill down on that. I won't, but that's so helpful. So many Christians claim persecution when really they're just a jerk.
Well, that's
that's
what I think.
And not good at what they're doing, right? And not good at what they're saying.
That's what's happened. Yeah, you definitely have to always evaluate. What's the Reddit channel? Am I the blank? Right.
Right.
That always could be true, and maybe since we're humans and we're sinners, they could both be true sometimes.
Sure. Yeah, sure.
The Philistines probably thought Samson was a jerk.
Sure. Of course.
But at the same time, you have to say, well, I'm going to do my best not to be one, but this is a clear boundary.
Yeah, of course.
And you've stepped over a boundary set by God here.
Yeah.
And so I'm not going to be able to agree with you on that. I'm not going to change what I teach to accommodate your unbelief. But at the same time, you can't be so concerned. I think the problem comes up when you're so concerned about what they think of you. What if they think I'm a jerk? Pray to the Lord, ask him to reveal it to you, but don't let that change you, because they probably do think that. Even if you're the nicest guy, they're going to think that. So don't let it be their view. Make God's standards your standard about what that is.
Man, that's good. Do you feel like the ground is changing a little bit? It feels like the United States, people have just become so sick and tired of all of the stuff we've had to live through over the last, a long time, but definitely the last 3 or 4 years, that people are, like normal people, are trying to push back on that. Do you feel that? Do you see that or sense that in the university system?
Oh yeah, I think in the university system, it's going to be the slowest, and it is the source of pumping out this ideology. So we got to change it. We're seeing some universities change already. Even before Trump got elected, they were getting rid of DEI.
Yeah.
Florida and Texas, Oklahoma are some big examples. ASU is going to probably be one of the last because it has made DEI such a part of the structure that everything this administration of ASU has done is going to have to be undone for that to happen. And so I'm kind of using ASU as a bellwether of when that happens there, we've done it. we've made progress. But
Right.
it's going to take a lot of work because they're just going to shift the words. They might get rid of DEI, but they're going to keep the content and still be teaching. They'll say, no, we're not teaching that. We're teaching patriotic pluralism, not DEI, but it's the same philosophy.
Yeah.
And so I think we need, that's what I'm hoping to be able to do. And we need others to join in to call that out and say, no, that's still the same philosophy, guys. And it's really a Marxist philosophy. They don't like that. But what I mean by Marxist philosophy is it believes that all of history is a conflict between have and have not. So it could be a racial conflict, an economic conflict. And the essence of it is this group has more and they oppress this group. Well, that's Marxism. That's the opening lines of the Marxist Communist Manifesto. And so that's called conflict theory. And so there always has to be that conflict. When they look into California history or they look into American history, the Christians are the oppressors over the indigenous peoples, some version like that. And so that needs to be thrown out. It's a crummy view of history. It's not accurate at all. And it will always make the white, cisgendered, conservative Christian the bad guy.
Right.
Because they think, well, you guys have been more successful. But there's other ways to account for that. Besides, like, I think when someone says, check your privilege, I say, I'll be happy to. My parents taught me the gospel at the age of 4.
Yeah.
That's the greatest privilege you could ever have.
Man, that's good. There's so many topics here. We could spend probably an hour on every single one of them, but really appreciate your perspectives and your help. Just so practical. Where can people find your Substack? You mentioned it earlier. If you could mention that again. You have a website. Anything else that you want to point people to?
Yeah, if you'd like to message me, the easiest way to do is go to Substack, so Dr. Owen Anderson, and then you can message me through there as a way of emailing me. I'll be happy to answer any more questions from your audience or questions from parents or potential students. Great. And then I'm also on Twitter. My Substack tends to be pretty focused about corruption at the university. On Twitter, it's more broad about my other publications and stuff. So that's also Dr. Owen Anderson. And so either one of those places, you can message me and ask me whatever you like. My webpage is also drowenanderson.com, where I've posted a lot of my articles, which are more of my academic side.
Yeah, you're not hard to find on the internet. It's actually I didn't know how many Dr. Owen Andersons there were, but when I went and looked, it comes right up with your stuff. So
but there are 3 of us that compete on Amazon to when you put in Owen Anderson.
Oh, really?
First, the one who wins the most. He's a professor of running. He has books out on how to run.
No kidding.
So it's really okay. That's interesting. There's another guy who does like research into petroleum and oil products. And then there's me. So we're pretty different. Like, you can't really confuse those subjects, but it doesn't, if you get Owen Anderson at the top, it doesn't always mean it's me, but it's pretty close. There's not too many Dr. Owen Andersons.
That's good. So if you find yourself on a Dr. Owen Anderson website talking about petroleum, wrong guy.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, not me.
Wrong guy. Oh man, Dr. Anderson, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thank you for the work that you're doing too. It's interesting. I think, not everyone listening to this would fall into kind of the Reformed theology world, and that's fine. But in that world specifically, you're kind of an outlier, I think, in doing this work where you're doing it, and really appreciate it. Thank you for what you're doing and for sharing it with others.
Yeah, thanks for that support. I mean, it means a lot. Your prayers mean a lot, and like I said, I know the Lord has purposes and goals here. I'm praying big, so you and your audience can pray big with me. I'm praying that there is transformation of our American university system. Yeah. It doesn't have to be explicitly Christian, although it can be. The universities have been, but it shouldn't be what it is now, where it's anti-Christian.
Yeah, that's
and so I'm praying real big that transformation happens in our lifetime. So maybe if it's not our kids, our grandkids say, I'm going to go to ASU. And we're pretty confident, you're going to get some good professors there who teach you some solid material.
It's good. Dr. Anderson, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Very, very helpful conversation. And man, the perspectives, so helpful. The principles, how we can raise our kids, know your kids, understand who they are and how prone they are to be pulled away by the opinions of others, preparing, discipling, training our kids, and understanding that one day they're going to move out of our house and they're going to go live life without us, and we need to prepare them for that. Very, very helpful, and I really appreciate that Dr. Anderson is also writing about these things on his Substack. Go ahead and check that out, and check out his other work. He even offers some videos and some courses to help just establish a better, more robust biblical worldview in an increasingly, I would say, anti-God world. It's just the way the world goes. We understand that. We've seen some good things happen, and we talk about that at the end of the interview. Even we've seen good things happening. Things are shifting, but they can shift again, and we need to be firmly rooted in the biblical precepts, biblical understanding of how we should move forward as Christians. And so very helpful conversation, great resources. Please go ahead and check those out. Take some time when you get a chance to go over to Life Audio, lifeaudio.com. You can find other great podcasts there. Also, always happy to push you there. You need to be subscribed to this podcast. You need to listen to this podcast, share this podcast out. But if you're looking for some other great hosts, you can go and check those out as well. And that would be fantastic. Thank you for joining the conversation, and I look forward to talking to you next time.